At 6:30 on a Saturday, I was in front of the mirror treating a family barbecue like a field problem, which should have told me something right there. I'm Hannah Ellison, 48 years old, 26 years into the Marine Corps, and 6 weeks into wearing a star I hadn't bothered to mention to most of my relatives. Brigadier General sounds impressive in a ceremony. In jeans, a gray top, and sunglasses, it disappears. That was the point. By the time I left my hotel for my aunt's house in Jacksonville, I looked exactly how I wanted my family to see me, ordinary. By sunset, one of them would learn the hard way how wrong that was. The promotion to Brigadier General had come through 6 weeks earlier. 07, 1 star. I was one of the few women in the history of the Marine Corps to wear it, and I hadn't told the extended family. Most of them knew I was in the Marines, the same way they knew my cousin Terrence worked at a bank somewhere in Raleigh. They'd heard it. They didn't ask about it. They certainly didn't understand what it meant. I was fine with that. I told myself I was fine with that. I grew up in Jacksonville, right outside the gates of Camp Lejeune. My father, Gunnery Sergeant Roy Ellison, was career enlisted, E7, retired after 24 years. He was strict in the way Marine fathers are strict, which is to say, he never raised his voice, because he never had to. You understood expectations by watching him. My mother, Denise, was a school nurse at the elementary school on base. She was warm where my father was quiet, soft where he was angled. Together they made a house that worked. I was the quiet kid, the one sitting on the porch at family cookouts with a book while everyone else played touch football. I played softball through middle school and ran cross country in high school. I got straight A's not because I was gifted, but because I was disciplined, a trait I got from my father and never thought to question. While other kids were figuring out who they wanted to be, I already knew I wanted to serve. My father never pushed that on me. He just lived it, and I watched. He told me once, when I was 15, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, "You're smart enough for anything, Hannah. Don't let anyone set your ceiling." I wrote it on a sticky note and put it inside my locker. I kept that note for 3 years, until the adhesive gave out and the paper curled at the edges. By then I didn't need it. The words were already part of me. The Ellison family was big and loud. My father had 2 brothers and a sister. His younger brother, Ray, was the fun one, charming, always laughing, always between jobs, never served a day in uniform. Uncle Ray was the guy who showed up to cookouts with a new girlfriend and a story about a business venture that never materialized. He married late. His wife, Jolene, was kind but overwhelmed from the start. She had Nick when I was 25 years old and freshly promoted to Captain 03, stationed at Camp Pendleton in California. I remember the phone call. My mother said, "Ray's got a boy, Nicholas." I was standing in my apartment off base, still in utilities, eating leftover pasta out of a container. I didn't know then that this baby would become the person who tested me more than any deployment, any command decision, any battlefield ever did. I adored Nick from the start. Every time I came home on leave, I brought him something, books, puzzles, a model airplane, once that took us 2 hours to glue together on Jolene's kitchen floor. He was a bright kid, with big eyes and a habit of following me around like a shadow. He called me Cousin Hannah with this earnestness that made my chest tight. I'd take him to the pier and we'd throw bread at the seagulls and he'd ask me questions about everything. Why is the sky blue? How do boats float? Can girls be Marines? That last one I answered by pointing at myself and saying, "What do you think?" He grinned like I'd told him a secret. When Nick was 7, Jolene called my mother in tears. Nick was struggling in school. Reading was hard for him. The teacher suggested testing, but the wait list was long and Jolene couldn't afford a private tutor. I paid for one. Didn't think twice. I was making a captain's salary and had nobody to spend it on but myself. I called Nick and told him, "You're sharper than you think. You just need someone who believes that." He was quiet for a second, then said, "You believe that?" I said, "I know it." I sent him birthday cards every year with cash inside. I called on holidays. I mailed him a Marine Corps challenge coin when he turned 8, told him it was a symbol of trust between Marines. He didn't fully understand what it meant, but he kept it in his dresser drawer. Jolene told me he'd show it to his friends and say, "My cousin gave me this. She's in the Marines." During those years, I was advancing. I completed a deployment to Afghanistan in 2005, commanding a logistics company in Helmand Province. I earned a meritorious service medal and a reputation for being calm under pressure. I was selected for the Marine Corps Command and Staff College at Quantico, which was a signal the Corps was investing in me. I made major at 3304. The family was vaguely proud. My mother mentioned it at Thanksgiving that year. Hannah got promoted again. Someone said, "That's nice." The conversation moved to football. I didn't blame them. Rank is invisible to civilians. The difference between a captain and a major means nothing if you don't live inside that world. To the Ellison family, I was just Hannah, who was in the Marines. They said it the way you'd say someone works for the government. It's a fact, not a fascination. Nobody asked what a major does. Nobody asked what I saw in Afghanistan. Nobody asked what it felt like to be responsible for 180 Marines in a combat zone at 30 years old. They didn't ask because they didn't know to ask, and I didn't offer because I didn't know how to bridge the gap between who I was at home and who I was everywhere else. The imbalance with Nick was already forming, though I didn't see it yet. I was the giver. He was the receiver. I gave him time, money, attention, and belief, without expectation, without keeping score. I saw myself in him, or at least I saw what I wanted to see. A kid from a tough household who needed someone steady. I thought I was planting seeds. I thought those seeds would grow into something that looked like respect, or at least recognition. I was wrong about the timeline. The last clear memory I have of Nick before everything shifted was a summer cookout when he was about 8. The sun was going down. The yard smelled like charcoal and bug spray. Nick was sitting next to me on the porch steps, eating a popsicle that was melting faster than he could keep up with. Purple streaks running down his wrist. He looked up at me and said, "When I grow up, I want to be like you." I laughed and said, "You'll be better." I meant it. I believed it completely. I didn't know yet how much that sentence would stay with me, not as a prediction, but as a question. Because wanting to be like someone requires knowing who they are. And as the years went on, Nick stopped knowing. He stopped looking, and eventually he stopped asking. But that night, sitting on those steps with a kid who thought I was the most impressive person he'd ever met, I felt something I rarely let myself feel. I felt seen. Not for the rank or the uniform or the medals locked in a drawer at my apartment. Just seen. By an 8-year-old with a melting popsicle and purple fingers who thought his cousin hung the moon. I should have known it wouldn't last. Nothing built on someone else's incomplete picture of you ever does. But I didn't know that yet. I was 33 years old, a major in the United States Marine Corps, and I thought love and loyalty were the same thing. They aren't. I'd learn the difference. It would just take another 15 years and a backyard Spar to teach me. The distance didn't happen all at once. It happened the way most important things happen, slowly, quietly, in the spaces between phone calls that got shorter and visits that got rarer. By the time I noticed the gap, it had already become the landscape. Nick turned 13 the year I made Lieutenant Colonel. 05. I was 40 years old, stationed at the Pentagon for a joint billet, which meant long hours in windowless rooms, briefing people who outranked me on things I couldn't discuss outside the building. My visits home dropped to maybe once a year, sometimes less. I still called. I still sent money on birthdays and holidays. I still asked Jolene how Nick was doing. The answers started getting vague. "He's fine. He's busy with school." You know how teenagers are. Nick was changing. Uncle Ray had left for good when Nick was 11, just didn't come home one afternoon, and the afternoon turned into a week, and the week turned into permanent. Jolene picked up extra shifts at the grocery store. Nick's grades dropped. He fell in with a group of kids who were going nowhere in particular and were in no hurry to get there. His teachers flagged behavior issues. The bright-eyed kid who used to follow me around the pier was becoming someone harder, angrier, more closed off. When I called for his 14th birthday, the conversation lasted 4 minutes. I asked him what he was reading. He said, "Nothing." I asked about school. He said, "It's fine." I asked if he got the book I sent, a biography of John Glenn, because Nick had once told me he thought space was cool. He said, "Yeah, thanks." He didn't mention it again. I told myself this was normal. Teenagers pull away. They stop calling back. They lose interest in the adults who used to fascinate them. I had my own life to manage, a command to run, evaluations to write, a career that demanded every hour I could give it. So I let the silence grow, and I filled it with work. What I didn't let myself feel was the sting of it, because the sting was specific. It wasn't just that Nick had stopped asking about me. It was that he had never started asking the right questions. He knew I was in the Marines. He'd known that his whole life. But he never once asked what I did, what rank I held, what my days looked like, what it meant to be a female officer in a combat branch, or what it cost to stay in for 2 decades. I was an abstraction to him. Cousin Hannah, who's in the Marines. And the abstraction never got updated. At 16, Nick told Jolene he wanted to enlist after high school. She told my mother, and my mother told me. I was proud, genuinely. I called Nick to offer guidance. I had tips for the physical fitness test, advice on what to expect at recruit training, suggestions for how to talk to recruiters without getting steamrolled. Nick listened politely. He said, "Yeah, cool, thanks." He didn't ask me a single question about my own experience. Not one. That was the moment I should have said something. I should have told him, "Nick, I've been a Marine for over 20 years. I'm a lieutenant colonel. I've commanded hundreds of Marines deployed to combat and earned my place in a world you're about to enter. Let me help you understand what you're walking into." But I didn't say that. I said, "Good luck," and I let the conversation end, because telling him felt like bragging. And I'd spent my entire life making sure nobody in my family ever felt smaller because of what I'd accomplished. Nick shipped to boot camp at Paris Island the fall he turned 18. He posted about it online, photos in Woodland Utilities, captions about earning the title of United States Marine. The family was excited in a way they'd never been about my career, and I understood why. Nick's version of being a Marine was visible. You could see the muscles, the uniform, the transformation photos. My version had always been invisible: office doors, briefing rooms, classified reports, quiet decisions that moved thousands of people and never made the news. Jolene cried at his boot camp graduation. Half the family drove down to Paris Island to watch him receive the Eagle, Globe, and Anchor. I couldn't attend. I was stationed overseas, managing a logistics element in support of operations I still can't fully discuss. I sent a handwritten letter and a new challenge coin, this one engraved with the lieutenant colonel insignia, a silver oak leaf. I told him I was proud and that the real work started now. He never acknowledged receiving it. That same year, I was promoted to colonel. 06. I was 43 years old and commanding a regiment, over 3,000 Marines under my authority. The ceremony was held at Camp Lejeune, and my parents attended. My mother cried. My father stood at attention in civilian clothes and didn't say a word, but his eyes were wet when they pinned the eagles on my collar. Nobody else from the family came. Nobody else was invited because nobody else had ever shown enough interest to warrant the invitation. Denise mentioned it at Thanksgiving. Hannah got promoted again. She's a full colonel now. Someone said, "Good for her." Someone else asked if the Cowboys were playing on Thursday. That was the extent of the family's engagement with the fact that one of their own had reached the senior officer ranks of the United States Marine Corps. Meanwhile, Nick was a private first class, then a lance corporal, E2, then E3. He was in the same corps as me, technically under the same commandant, saluting the same flag. But we might as well have been on different planets. He was cleaning weapons and standing post and learning what it meant to be the lowest-ranking person in every room. I was briefing generals, reviewing operational plans, and shaping policy that affected the entire Marine Expeditionary Force. The distance between a lance corporal and a colonel is not just rank, it's an entirely different experience of the same institution. Nick didn't know any of this. He didn't ask. To him, the Marine Corps was what he could see from the ground floor, the barracks, the chow hall, the NCOs, who controlled his daily existence. The idea that his bookworm cousin operated in the stratosphere, above all of that she had the authority to end careers and direct missions and advise generals who made decisions affecting global security, that idea had simply never occurred to him. Not because he was stupid, because nobody in his life had ever made it real for him, including me. The question that kept surfacing was, whose fault is invisibility? Is it the fault of the people who don't see you, or the fault of the person who never insisted on being seen? I didn't have an answer then. I still don't have a clean one now. But I know this much. By the time Nick was a lance corporal and I was a colonel, the gap between us was so vast that even if he'd looked up, he wouldn't have known what he was looking at. The last time I saw Nick before the barbecue was at a family funeral when he was 20. My father's sister, Aunt Grace, passed away from cancer. Nick came in his dress blues, looking sharp. I was in civilian clothes. We hugged briefly. He said, "Hey, Cousin Hannah." I said, "Hey, Nick." He spent the reception showing off for the younger cousins, stories from the fleet, demonstrations of Marine Corps martial arts program techniques in the parking lot. I sat inside with my parents and drank bad coffee and watched through the window and thought, he has no idea. He has absolutely no idea who I am. And the quiet thing I didn't say to anyone, not even Diane, was this: I wasn't hurt yet. I was just invisible. And the strange thing about being invisible to someone you love is that you keep hoping they'll look up one day and see you. But they don't, because they never knew where to look. The barbecue was at Jolene's house on a Saturday in late June. I pulled up around 1300 hours and sat in the rental car for a full minute before getting out. The yard was already full: folding tables, coolers, kids running through a sprinkler, someone's Bluetooth speaker playing 90s R&B too loud from the back porch. I could hear Uncle Terrence's laugh from the driveway. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid hit me the second I opened the car door. And for a moment, I was 12 years old again, carrying a plate of my mother's potato salad across the grass. I walked into the yard and started making the rounds, hugged my mother, shook hands with cousins I hadn't seen in years. My father was in his usual spot, a lawn chair in the shade, a plate balanced on one knee, watching everything and saying nothing. He looked at me when I walked up, and I saw something in his eyes that I recognized from decades of service, the look of a man who knows something the room doesn't. Hey, Daddy. Hey, baby girl. That was enough. We understood each other. People were friendly, warm even. A cousin named Marcus said, Hannah, you look great. You haven't aged a day. A cousin named Tamika said, Girl, where have you been? Another cousin, I think it was Dwayne, asked, You still doing the Marines thing? I said, Still at it. He nodded and changed the subject to his new truck. That was the full extent of anyone's curiosity about my 26-year career. I didn't push it. I never did. I got a plate, found a chair near my mother, and settled in. I was here for the food, the family, the normalcy. The star on my collar, the one I'd earned 6 weeks ago in a ceremony attended by 2 3-star generals and the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, was tucked away in a case at my hotel. Today I was just Hannah. Then Nick arrived. He pulled up in a pickup truck with the windows down, wearing a Marine Corps t-shirt, cargo shorts, and boots. He was 23 years old, thick-necked, and carrying himself with the kind of confidence that young corporals develop when they've had just enough responsibility to feel important, but not enough to understand how much they don't know. E4. 2 chevrons crossed with rifles. In the grand architecture of the Marine Corps, he was standing in the lobby. He spotted me across the yard. There was a flicker of recognition, the way you acknowledge a face you haven't seen in years, but no warmth. Hey, Cousin Hannah. I nodded. Hey, Nick. He moved on. That was it. Within minutes, Nick became the center of gravity for the younger cousins. He was demonstrating Marine Corps martial arts program techniques in the side yard, takedowns, arm bars, hip throws on a willing cousin named Jerome, who kept getting put on the ground and laughing about it. Nick narrated everything like a drill instructor. See, what you do is you control the wrist, then you step through. The family watched with genuine admiration. Jolene was beaming. Here was her son, her Marine, her proof that the Ellison name still produced something strong. I watched from the patio with my iced tea and felt something I'd been suppressing for years. It wasn't jealousy, it was recognition. Nick's version of being a Marine was legible to this family. They could see it, the muscles, the shirt, the demonstrations, the stories. My version, the decades of service, the commands, the deployments, the quiet authority that comes from leading thousands, was invisible because it didn't perform. I had never performed. Nick, riding the energy, looked over at me. He was breathing hard, grinning, adrenaline up. Hey, Hannah, you ever do any of this stuff? Or you just do paperwork? A few cousins laughed, not cruelly, casually, the way people laugh when they think they're in on the joke. I raised an eyebrow. I've had some training. Nick stepped toward me, bouncing on his toes. Come on, let's go around, just for fun. I'll teach you a few things. The yard started paying attention. Jolene looked uneasy. My mother shook her head slightly. My father leaned back in his lawn chair and said nothing. He didn't need to. He'd been a gunnery sergeant for 20 years. He knew exactly what was about to happen. I set my iced tea down on the arm of the chair. I looked at Nick, really looked at him. The kid I'd bought books for, the teenager who'd stopped calling, the young Marine standing in front of me with absolutely no idea who I was, asking to fight me like I was a civilian at a carnival booth. He was offering to teach me something about being a Marine. He didn't know I'd been a Marine since 1998. He didn't know I held a black belt in the Marine Corps martial arts program. He didn't know I'd completed close quarters combat instructor courses, that I'd trained alongside special operations units, that I'd been in situations he couldn't imagine and hadn't flinched. This was the betrayal. Not a cruel word, not a deliberate attack. It was worse, it was total, casual, comfortable ignorance. 25 years of pouring myself into this kid, and he looked at me in jeans and saw a woman who did paperwork. "Sure," I said. "Let's go." We stepped onto the grass. The family formed a loose semicircle. Nick rolled his shoulders, settled into his fighting stance. He was grinning. "I'll go easy on you," he said. My expression didn't change. I squared up, and the way I squared up was the first sign that something was wrong with Nick's assumptions. My stance was low, balanced, weight-centered, hands relaxed at guard. It was the stance of someone who'd done this 1,000 times in training environments he'd never set foot in. But Nick didn't notice. He was already committed to the story he'd told himself. He moved first, a wide, telegraphed grab meant to be playful but dominant. I slipped it cleanly, redirected his momentum, stepped inside his guard, swept his lead leg at the ankle, and guided him to the ground with a controlled takedown that used his weight against him. It was fast, clean, and precise. Not violent, surgical. Nick hit the grass on his back, staring up at the sky. The yard went dead silent. Nick scrambled up, confused. The grin was gone. "Again," he said. This time he came harder, a proper clinch attempt, using his size and weight advantage, the kind of aggressive forward pressure they teach at the basic level. I shifted my hips, executed a textbook arm drag to back control, and put him face down in the grass in under 4 seconds. I held the position for 2 beats, controlled, deliberate. Then I leaned close to his ear and said it quietly so only he could hear. "Stand down, Marine." Nick rolled over, breathing hard. He looked up at me and his face was cycling through things he didn't have words for. Confusion, embarrassment, something that looked like the beginning of understanding. Before he could speak, my father stood up from his lawn chair. He looked at the yard, every cousin, every aunt, every uncle staring in silence, and he said, loud and clear, "Some of you might not know this. Hannah got her star 6 weeks ago. You're looking at Brigadier General Ellison, United States Marine Corps." Nobody moved. Then my mother started clapping, then Jolene, then the whole yard, not mocking, but stunned and proud and confused and ashamed all at once. Nick was still on the ground. He looked up at me, and I watched his face go through 5 things in 3 seconds. Shock, shame, something breaking open, and then something softer, something that looked like the 8-year-old kid who once told me he wanted to be like me when he grew up. I offered him my hand. He took it. I pulled him to his feet and held on for an extra second. He said he'd go easy on me. He didn't know I'd been carrying the weight of that uniform since before he was born. The betrayal wasn't the Spar. It was every year of silence that made him think he needed to go easy on me in the first place. The barbecue went on for another 3 hours after that. People ate, kids played, the music kept going. But the energy had changed. There was something electric in the air now. A current running through the yard that hadn't been there before. Cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years were suddenly finding reasons to stand near me. "Hannah, how long have you been in? What does a general do exactly? Do people salute you?" I answered every question politely because that's what you do. But I felt the irony of it like a bruise on a rib. 26 years of service. And it took physically putting a man on the ground for anyone in my own family to be curious about what I do for a living. Nick was quiet the rest of the afternoon. He didn't avoid me, but he didn't approach me either. He sat at the edge of the yard in a folding chair, nursing a can of something, staring at the grass where I'd put him down twice. A couple of the younger cousins tried to joke with him. "She got you, bro." Cousin Hannah's built different. He didn't laugh. He didn't snap back. He just nodded and said something like, "Yeah, she is." I could see it happening in real time, the recalibration. He was doing the math for the first time. His cousin, a brigadier general, in his branch. The same Marine Corps he'd been walking around in for 5 years as a corporal, flexing at family cookouts like he'd invented the institution. And he'd never once thought to ask. I left the barbecue around 1700 hours, hugged my parents, told Jolene the food was perfect, nodded at Nick from across the yard. He nodded back, and there was something in his eyes, not shame exactly, but the beginning of something that might eventually become understanding. I drove to my hotel and sat on the bed for a while without turning on the lights. Then I called Diane. Colonel Diane Marsh was the closest thing I had to a best friend inside the Corps. We'd met at Command and Staff College in 2009 and stayed close through 15 years of parallel careers. She was sharp, honest, and the only person I trusted with the full, unfiltered version of myself. I told her what happened, all of it. The challenge, the spar, the reveal, the silence afterward. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you feel?" I said. "I don't know. I thought it would feel like winning. It just feels like sadness with better lighting." Diane said, "You didn't do anything wrong. He challenged you. You accepted. You didn't humiliate him. You showed him the truth." I told her she was right, but the truth that was sitting heavier was the bigger one. The truth is that my own family didn't know who I was, Diane, and the one person I poured the most into knew the least. She let that sit. Then she said, "Hannah, you've been hiding from that family for 20 years. You go home and you fold yourself up like a flag and put yourself in a drawer. That's not their fault. That's yours too." I didn't argue. She wasn't wrong. Over the following days, I processed. Not with drama. I've never been built for drama. I processed the way I've been trained to process, the same way I'd run an after-action review on a mission that didn't go as planned. What happened, why, what I missed. What I'd do differently. I thought about the phone calls Nick never returned, the challenge coin he never acknowledged, the book about John Glenn that he never mentioned, the offer to help him prepare for enlistment that he took with the enthusiasm of someone receiving a parking ticket. I thought about every Thanksgiving where my promotions were announced and met with the conversational equivalent of a shrug. None of it was malicious. None of it was intentional. And that's what made it worse. You can fight cruelty. You can confront disrespect. But you can't fight indifference. Indifference doesn't even know it's in the room. I sat with the question that kept circling. Was I angry at Nick, or was I angry at myself? The answer, when it finally surfaced, was uncomfortable. Both. I was angry at Nick for never looking up, and I was angry at myself for making it so easy for him not to. I had accepted invisibility as the price of belonging. I had tucked my career away every time I came home, like it was something to apologize for. I had shrunk. I visited my parents the next morning before heading to the airport. My father was on the front porch, coffee in hand, watching the street the way retired Marines watch everything, with the calm attention of someone who spent decades assessing environments. He didn't bring up the Spar. Instead, he said, "You know why I told them about the star?" I sat down next to him. "Because Nick needed to know." He shook his head slowly. "No, because you needed them to know. You've been hiding from this family for years, Hannah. Not your rank, yourself. You come home and you tuck it all away like it's something to be embarrassed about. It's not." I looked at him. This man, this retired gunnery sergeant who'd served 24 years and never once talked about himself at a cookout either, was telling me to stop doing the thing he'd taught me to do. And he was right. The invisibility wasn't just the family's failure. I'd participated in it. I'd maintained it. I'd chosen it over and over because being seen meant being different, and being different in a family like ours meant being alone. He took a sip of his coffee and said, "You earned that star. Let people see it. The ones who can't handle it, that's their problem, not yours." I flew back that afternoon, sat in the window seat, watched North Carolina disappear below the clouds. And I understood something that I'd been circling for weeks, maybe years. The Spar showed Nick who I was. But my father showed me something harder, that I'd been complicit in my own erasure, and that was the thing I actually needed to fix. I made a decision in the weeks after the barbecue. It wasn't dramatic. I didn't announce it. I didn't write it down or call a family meeting. I just decided, quietly and completely, that I was done being invisible. I was done tucking my career into a back pocket every time I walked into a family gathering. This didn't mean I was going to become someone who talks about herself at every dinner table. It meant I was going to stop apologizing, internally, constantly, reflexively, for the fact that I had accomplished something extraordinary. I started with small things. The next time I visited my parents, I brought a framed photograph from my promotion ceremony. Me in dress blues, the commandant pinning the star on my collar, my father standing behind me in his suit. I put it on the living room shelf next to the family photos. My mother looked at it and said, "It's about time." My father said nothing. He just straightened the frame a quarter inch and walked back to the porch. When a cousin called and asked what I was up to, I told him the truth. I'm at Quantico this week. I'm overseeing a readiness assessment for a Marine Expeditionary Brigade. He was quiet for a second, then said, I don't even know what that means. I said, it means I'm responsible for making sure about 12,000 Marines are ready to deploy if the nation needs them. He said, 12,000? I said, give or take. The conversation shifted after that. Not dramatically, but measurably. He asked a follow-up question. That was new. Nick, meanwhile, was going through something of his own. He'd returned to his unit at Camp Lejeune after the barbecue, and the experience was replaying in his head on a loop. Jolene told my mother that he'd been different since he came back. Quieter, more internal, less interested in being the center of every room. What he was reading, I found out later, was everything he could find about Marine Corps general officers. He Googled Brigadier general requirements and read about the decades of command, the combat deployments, the selection boards, the congressional confirmations. He looked up my name and found a few official mentions, a photo from a ceremony in the Marine Corps Times, a brief note in a command newsletter about a new brigadier general assignment. He stared at the photo. His cousin, in dress blues, a star on her collar. And he felt for the first time the true scale of the distance between where he was and where I'd been for years. He started noticing things at his unit that he'd previously ignored. The way officers carried themselves, not with bravado, but with a kind of settled authority that came from years of responsibility. The chain of command, which he'd always understood as an abstraction, suddenly became concrete. He looked at his battalion commander, a lieutenant colonel, and realized for the first time that his cousin outranked that man by 2 full grades. His cousin outranked his commanding officer's commanding officer. The scale of it kept arriving in waves, each one bigger than the last. His entire identity as a Marine had been built on a simple foundation. He was the one who'd earned it. The tough one. The one who went to boot camp, survived the crucible, picked up corporal in 4 years. In the family, he was the Marine. He wore it on his chest, literally and figuratively. And now he knew that while he'd been building that identity brick by brick, his cousin had already built the whole building. I'd been a Marine since 1998. He shipped to Paris Island in 2021. I had a star. He had 2 chevrons crossed with rifles. The math was staggering, and Nick was not someone who'd ever been good at sitting with that kind of math. His squad noticed the change. Nick had always been the loud one, the corporal who told the best stories, who could make the whole barracks laugh, who walked into the motor pool like he owned the place. Now he was quieter, more watchful. A lance corporal in his fire team asked him one morning, "You good, Corporal Ellison?" Nick said, "Yeah. Growing up, I guess." That was the most honest thing he'd said in months. His staff sergeant, an E6 named Patterson, noticed the change. Nick was showing up earlier, talking less, working harder. Patterson pulled him aside one morning after physical training and asked if everything was squared away at home. Nick said, "Yeah, Staff Sergeant, just thinking." Patterson wasn't used to hearing that from Corporal Ellison, so he let it go. I was going through my own transformation, though it looked different from the outside. I was settling into the generalship, but more than that, I was settling into the idea that visibility wasn't vanity. For 26 years, I treated my accomplishments like classified information around my own family. After the barbecue, I stopped doing that. Not loudly, just consistently. I accepted an invitation to speak at a women's leadership symposium at Quantico. I almost said no. I'd turned down speaking engagements before, uncomfortable with the spotlight. But something had shifted. I said yes. I stood behind a podium in front of 200 military women, officers, enlisted, civilians, and told my story. Not the barbecue, the career, the deployments. The first time I walked into a room full of colonels and realized I was the only woman. The first time a subordinate questioned my authority, and I had to decide in that moment whether to crush him or teach him. The nights I sat alone in temporary housing overseas and wondered if the sacrifice was worth it. I spoke plainly. No poetry, no slogans, just the truth as I'd lived it. The room was silent. Afterward, a young second lieutenant, 01, couldn't have been more than 23, approached me with tears she was trying to hide. She said, "Ma'am, I needed to hear that. I feel invisible sometimes." I looked at her and said, "You're not invisible. You're just early. Keep going." That night, alone in my hotel room, I understood something I hadn't before. The star wasn't just about authority, it was about responsibility. The responsibility to be visible, not for ego, not for applause, but so the women and men coming behind me could see the path and know it existed. I'd been so busy hiding that I'd forgotten someone might need to find me. The family was dealing with the aftershock. The barbecue story spread through the Ellison network the way family stories do, fast, distorted, and with increasing dramatic embellishment. Did you hear Hannah dropped Nick? She's a general, like a real one. Several family members reached out in the weeks after, calls, texts, social media messages. Hannah, I had no idea. Why didn't you tell us? We're so proud of you. I was polite to all of them. But I noticed something I hadn't expected. I could feel the difference between people who were genuinely interested and people who were interested in the story. Some wanted to know me. Others wanted the reflected glow of having a general in the family. The distinction was subtle, but after 26 years of reading people, subordinates, peers, adversaries, allies, I was good at subtle. Jolene called my mother emotional. I didn't know Denise. I knew she was in the Marines, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know it was this big. My mother, with the quiet steel that comes from raising a daughter who commands thousands and never once asked for applause, said, "You could have asked, Jolene. Any time in the last 26 years, you could have asked." I talked to Diane about it one evening. She said, "You spent 26 years training for the hardest jobs in the Marine Corps. Now you're learning how to be seen by your own family. Which one's harder?" I said, "The family. By a mile." She laughed. I almost did too. The truth was settling into something I could live with. The barbecue hadn't fixed anything. It had cracked something open. And now I had to decide what to do with the light coming through. About 10 weeks after the barbecue, Nick sent me a text message. I was at my desk at Quantico, reviewing readiness reports, when my personal phone lit up on the corner of the desk. I picked it up. His name. A message. "Hey, I've been thinking about things. Can we talk sometime?" I read it 3 times. I set the phone down. I went back to my reports. 20 minutes later, I picked it up again and read it a 4th time. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was angry, and not because I was playing a game. I needed to sit with it. I needed to figure out what I wanted from a conversation with Nick, and whether what I wanted was reasonable. Was I hoping for an apology? For understanding? For the kid I used to know to come back? I wasn't sure. So I gave myself a day, and then I replied, "I'd like that. When you're ready." 4 words. I meant every one of them, but I also meant the space between them, the space that said, "This is your move, Nick. I'll be here, but you have to walk through the door. I'm done carrying people to the threshold." The phone call came on a Sunday evening, about 12 weeks after the barbecue. I was at my apartment in Virginia, standing in the kitchen making dinner, grilled chicken, rice, steamed broccoli, the same meal I've made 1,000 times because consistency in small things keeps me anchored when everything else is moving fast. My personal phone rang, Nick's name on the screen. I turned the stove down, wiped my hands, and answered, "Hey, Nick!" "Hey, Hannah!" It was awkward at first. Long pauses filled with the ambient sound of his barracks in the background, someone's television, a door closing down the hall. He started where young men always start when they don't know how to say the hard thing: safe territory. He told me about his unit, his daily schedule, the upcoming training exercise his company was preparing for. I listened. I didn't fill the silences. I let him find his way to whatever he actually called to say. It took about 10 minutes. Then his voice shifted, got lower, more careful, and he said, "I didn't know what you were. I knew you were in the Marines, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't understand. I looked it up after the barbecue and I felt sick." He said, "Because I stood in front of the whole family and asked you to spar like you were some random person. And you're not. You're a 1-star general. In my branch. I'm an E4, and I asked an 07 to fight me in the backyard. I didn't even know." His voice cracked on the last word, and I could hear him swallow hard. "I've been walking around thinking I was something, Hannah, and my own cousin was already everything I'm trying to be. And I never once asked you about it. Not once." I let that sit. The silence was important. I'd spent 26 years in rooms where silence carried more weight than words, and I knew better than to rush past it. Then I said, "Nick, I'm not upset about the spar. I'm a Marine. I can handle a spar." I paused. What hurt was everything before it. The years of not asking, the years of me calling and getting nothing back, the birthday money in the books and the challenge coin I sent you that you never mentioned. That's what hurt. Not the backyard. The 15 years of silence that led to the backyard. Another long pause. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, very quietly, I still have the coin, both of them. The one from when I was a kid, and the one you sent when I graduated boot camp. They're in my wall locker. My composure wavered, just for half a second, a tightness behind my eyes that I blinked away. I recovered and said, okay, that's something. I listened to all of it. And then I told him the truth, because he'd earned the truth by calling. Nick, I appreciate this call. I mean that. But I'm not going to tell you everything's fine because it's not fine yet. Trust doesn't come back because of one phone conversation. It comes back because of what you do next. Consistently, over time. That's how it works in the Corps, and that's how it works in a family. He was quiet. Then he said, I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm asking if the door's still open. I said, it was never closed, Nick. You just hadn't knocked. Over the following weeks, he started texting me. Short messages, nothing elaborate. Updates, questions, the kind of small contact that builds a bridge one plank at a time. Got my first perfect PFT score, 297. I texted back. Outstanding. Now do it again next quarter. He sent a photo of a book on his rack, A History of the Marine Corps in the Pacific Theater. I wrote back, good choice. Read the chapter on Iwo Jima twice. He asked me questions about his career for the first time. Real questions. My staff sergeant said I'm up for the Meritorious Sergeant Board. What's that like? I told him, it's an opportunity to prove you're ready for more responsibility. Study your knowledge, know your Marines. Walk in like you belong there, because you do. He sent back a thumbs up emoji and then, 10 minutes later, a longer message. Thank you. For real. I didn't baby him. When he complained about a sergeant in his platoon who he felt was riding him too hard, I said, respect the rank. You don't have to like the person, but you respect what they carry. That's the deal. Every rank in this Corps was earned by someone who showed up and did the work, including yours, including his. He didn't push back. He was listening now, and the difference between Nick listening and Nick performing was like the difference between a loaded weapon and a prop. Jolene called my mother about a month into this new pattern. She said, whatever Hannah said to him, it's working. He's different, more focused, less loud. He's actually reading books, Denise. I can't remember the last time I saw him read a book. My mother relayed this to me, and I said, I didn't say anything special, Mama. I just answered the phone. She said, baby, sometimes answering the phone is the special thing. She wasn't wrong. After everything, the years of silence, the barbecue, the spar, the casual indignity of being asked to fight by someone who didn't know he was standing in the presence of a flag officer, I could have let the call go to voicemail. I could have closed the door. I chose not to. Not because forgiveness is easy, but because I've spent my entire career believing that people can grow. I've watched 18-year-old recruits become leaders. I've watched struggling lieutenants become exceptional commanders. Growth is the whole point of this institution. And Nick was growing, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks I'm sure I didn't see, but the direction was right. 6 months after the barbecue, I was standing on the second-floor balcony of my apartment in Virginia at 05:45 in the morning, drinking coffee and watching the sun come up over the tree line. The morning was cool, early December, the kind of crisp air that makes everything feel precise. Something about the morning felt different, lighter. I'd been feeling that lightness more often in the months since the barbecue. Not happiness exactly. Happiness is too simple a word for something this layered. It was more like integration. For 26 years, I'd been two people. There was the Hannah who showed up at family cookouts in jeans and smiled and ate potato salad and let people call her Hannah who's in the Marines. And there was Brigadier General Ellison who briefed 3 stars, shaped operational plans, and carried the weight of decisions that affected thousands of lives. Those 2 women had lived in the same body, but never in the same room. After the barbecue, they merged, and it turned out that being one whole person took a lot less energy than being 2 half people. I'd started running again, not the mandatory physical fitness runs, but real runs, early morning, just for the clarity of it. I'd picked up painting, something I hadn't done since the Naval Academy, when I used to sketch the Chesapeake Bay from the seawall during study breaks. I cooked elaborate meals on weekends and sent photos to Diane, who responded with commentary that ranged from genuine compliments to ruthless critique. "That risotto looks like you deployed it too early," she wrote once. I laughed so hard I startled my neighbor's dog. I was visiting my parents more often, not out of obligation, out of want. I sat on their porch and told them stories I'd never shared before. The deployment to Afghanistan, when my convoy got hit and I had to lead my team through a secondary ambush zone with 2 casualties and no air support for 40 minutes. The time at the 10-year mark when I almost submitted my resignation because the loneliness of command had become unbearable. And a gunnery sergeant named Reeves sat me down in an empty office and told me the Corps needed people who feel it this deep and that I shouldn't dare quit. The night I found out I was being promoted to colonel and sat in my car in the parking lot and cried, not from joy, but from exhaustion, from the accumulated weight of 2 decades of never being allowed to stop. My mother listened to these stories with tears running down her face. My father just nodded. He knew. He'd always known. He'd been a Marine for 24 years. He understood the things you carry that you never put on a shelf. Nick, meanwhile, was becoming a different Marine. He'd been selected for the Meritorious Sergeant Board and was preparing with a seriousness that his chain of command had never seen from him. Nick called me once a week now, and the conversations were real, about leadership, about the Corps, about what it means to earn something versus just claiming it. During one call, he said something that stopped me. "I used to think being a Marine was about being hard. You showed me it's about being sharp. There's a difference." I told him, there is, and the sharp ones last longer. The extended family had recalibrated too. My rank was no longer the family's best-kept accidental secret. It was discussed openly, sometimes with pride, sometimes with the lingering embarrassment of people who realized they'd had a general in their midst for years and treated her like she worked at an office. But the more important shift was subtler. People were treating me differently, not with awe, with attention. Real questions, real curiosity, the kind of engagement that said, "We see you now, and we're sorry it took this long." Jolene texted me a photo of Nick studying for his board, flashcards spread across his rack, a cup of coffee, a look of concentration I'd never seen on his face. She wrote underneath, "You're doing." I wrote back, "His doing. I just answered the phone." My mother told me during a visit that my father had been different since the barbecue too. "He's been walking around this house 6 inches taller," she said, "like someone finally validated something he's been carrying for 30 years. I smiled. My father would never admit that. He would hear it, nod once, and change the subject. That's just how he's built. But I wasn't done processing. The reconciliation with Nick was real and ongoing, but the harder reconciliation was the one I was having with myself. The question I kept circling, the one that woke me up at 04:30 some mornings and followed me through the day, was this. Why did I accept invisibility for so long? Why did I let "that's just how family is" become an excuse for people not seeing me? I didn't have a neat answer. I'm not sure I needed one. The pattern was broken. That was enough for now. The lie I'd been telling myself since I was 22 years old and walked across the stage at Annapolis was that humility meant hiding. I spent 26 years becoming someone extraordinary. I don't say that with arrogance. I say it with the clarity of someone who knows what it costs. The deployments, the missed holidays, the relationships that didn't survive the distance, the nights in temporary housing overseas where the silence was so thick it had weight, the rooms full of men who looked at me and saw an obstacle before they saw an officer. I earned every promotion, every billet, every ounce of authority I carry. And then I spent those same 26 years making sure nobody at home ever had to deal with any of that. I dimmed myself at every cookout, every phone call, every holiday visit. I let people call me Hannah who's in the Marines like it was a hobby, like it wasn't the central defining commitment of my entire adult life. And I told myself that was humility. But it wasn't humility. It was fear. Fear that if they saw all of me, the full, unedited, flag rank, combat-tested, policy-shaping version of me, they wouldn't know what to do with it. So I gave them a version in between, a version that smiled and ate potato salad and said, "Still at it," when someone asked about my career. And that version was invisible. Because she wasn't real. Nick made Sergeant E5. He called me the day he got pinned. "I wanted you to be the first person I told." I could hear it in his voice, not the old bravado, but something steadier. Pride that had been earned through work, not volume. I told him, "I'm proud of you, Nick, genuinely." He said, I'm going to earn it this time, for real. I believed him. Not because the words were perfect, but because the months of small, consistent effort behind them had built something I could trust. He asked me to come to his promotion ceremony at Camp Lejeune. I said yes. I flew in on a Friday, checked into a hotel off base, and showed up the next morning in civilian clothes, jeans, a blazer, sunglasses, just like the barbecue. But this time, when Nick introduced me to his staff sergeant, he stood up straight, looked Patterson in the eye, and said, "Staff Sergeant Patterson, this is my cousin, Brigadier General Ellison, United States Marine Corps." Patterson's eyes went wide. He snapped to a position that was halfway between attention and disbelief. "Ma'am, it's an honor, ma'am." I shook his hand and said, "At ease, Staff Sergeant. I'm just here as family today." But I saw the look he gave Nick afterward, a look that said, "You've been holding out on us, Ellison." And Nick grinned, not the old grin, a new one, the kind of grin you wear when you're proud of someone else instead of yourself. After the ceremony, Nick walked me to the parking lot. We stood between two rows of cars in the December sun, and he reached into his cargo pocket and pulled something out. A challenge coin. Not the new one I'd sent at boot camp graduation, the old one. The one I'd given him when he was 7 years old. It was worn smooth at the edges. The Marine Corps emblem was faded. It had been carried for 16 years, through a childhood, through an enlistment, through a reckoning. He put it in my hand. "I've been carrying this since I was a kid," he said. "I think it's time I earned my own." I looked at the coin, I turned it over. I felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was almost nothing, but the other weight. The weight of years. The weight of a kid who used to follow me to the pier. The weight of silence and distance and a backyard spar and a phone call on a Sunday night. My composure cracked. Just for a second. I blinked hard and looked at the sky until my eyes were clear. Then I gave the coin back. "Keep it," I said. "That's not a loan. That's a gift, and you've already started earning what it stands for." He closed his hand around it and nodded. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to. I drove back to the hotel alone. The sun was going down over Jacksonville, painting the sky the same colors I'd been trying to capture in my apartment with watercolors, and failing. I pulled into the parking lot and turned off the engine and sat there. I didn't go to that barbecue to prove anything. I didn't put him on the ground to teach him a lesson. I just showed up as myself, no rank, no title, no armor, and let the truth do the work. He said he'd go easy on me, but the person who'd been going easy on everyone for years was me. Turns out they just needed permission to see me standing at full height. If this story hit you somewhere real, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And tell me in the comments, have you ever dimmed yourself to make someone else comfortable? Has someone in your life ever underestimated you because they never bothered to ask what you actually do? And what would it look like if you stopped hiding and let them see the full version of you? I'll be reading every single one.